And before we start, for I would like to take a moment, for our land acknowledgement. So I guess it's okay. We have some people already in the chat. Oh, some people from Colombia too. Hello. All right. So let's go with land acknowledgement. As you know, McGill University is on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. This is also an invitation to reflect on the languages and the cultures of indigenous peoples and their territories around the world, wherever you are located right now. Welcome everyone again to our second Multilingual Speaker Series. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Bienvenidos y gracias a todos por acompañarnos hoy. Bienvenue et merci à tous d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. Benvenuti e grazie a tutti per essere con noi oggi. Bem-vindos e obrigado a todos por se juntarem a nós hoje. Over the next hour, we'll be discussing voices from Latin America, decolonial, multilingual, and multimodal resisting practices. And we'll have 30 minutes at the end of the session for your questions. My name is Miguel Sanchez. I'm a second-year PhD student at the Department of Integrated Studies in Education at McGill University. My research project focuses on exploring the advantages and disadvantages of using generative AI, so artificial intelligence, and especially the multimodal affordances. So today's talk is going to be touching on the multimodal part of it for students' created projects in relation to the development of critical pluriliteracies. That means digital media and information literacies. To do this, I'm planning an intervention in public schools or public institutions in Bogota, Colombia. And we are joined today by Dr. Mario López-Gopar. Dr. López-Gopar is a professor at the Facultad de Idiomas de la Universidad Autónoma Benito Juárez in Oaxaca, Mexico. His main research interests are intercultural and multilingual education of indigenous peoples and decolonizing pedagogies. Apart from having published articles in top-tier journals and numerous book chapters, his most recent books are Decolonizing Primary English Language Teaching and also International Perspectives on Critical Pedagogies in ELT. Dr. López-Gopar will be talking about resisting decolonial practices carried out by minoritized groups in multilingual and multimodal, in a multilingual and multimodal fashion. During the presentation, he will showcase artistic creations by different indigenous and Afro-Latin American artists in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is also a testament to these minoritized groups' linguistic creativity and decolonizing, resisting, and re-existing practices, as he says. So before we move on to the talk, just a moment, change here my slide. A little bit of Zoom etiquette before we start. So just a moment, get lost. Okay, so please, during the talk, keep your videos and sound off. You can use the thumbs up and the hands clapping. You can also send hearts if you want at the end of the discussion. And the talk will be recorded and available in the Plurilingual Lab YouTube channel. After the talk, we will have 30 minutes for discussion. You can post your questions in the chat, or you can unmute your microphones and ask a question directly. And this part of the discussion will not be recorded. I'm going to be moderating this part as well. So now I pass it on to you, Dr. López-Gopar, and we will start with the discussion. So stop sharing here.
Thank you. Thank you, Miguel. Muchas gracias, Angelica. Let me share my screen. And I know that the format is supposed to be 1 hour for presentations and 30 minutes for discussions, But if you don't mind, if people have questions in between the presentations, then we can talk about it. Especially if it is something that it is engaging for them or problematic for them, hopefully, then we can stop it and talk about it if that's okay to make it a little bit more interactive. No? So let me share my screen. Okay. Want to make sure that everybody can everybody see it? Can you please tell me if everybody can see it? Yep. Okay, fantastic. Okay, gracias, Lorena.
Mario,
Yep.
it's just not in full screen. So if you'd like to make it full screen.
Okay, yes, I will. Okay, there you go, right? Then it's better. Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Okay. Bueno, buenos días, bon dia, buongiorno, bonjour. Quiero, first of all, today I'll be talking about voices from Latin America and decolonial, multilingual, and multimodal resisting practices. And I hope in these presentations, I'll be talking a little bit about multilingualism first, and then decolonial. In the multimodal aspect, I would like the videos that I'm going to show you in the different creations by multiple artists to speak for themselves. And but before that, I'll just give a quick introduction as to what multimodality means, or the way I view it. Also, I'd like to acknowledge that this work is actually part of a handbook chapter that I co-author with my colleague Lorena Córdoba Hernández and Jorge Valtierra Zamudio. And but this one is more like interactive presentation on the end. Seeing this one, moving. Okay. So first of all, I would like to say muchas gracias, muito obrigado, and thanks to Angélica Galante for the invitation to this series. Time flies. I think we communicated like 5-6 months ago about this, and was just the crazy schedule. Just finding a date was the first challenge. But anywho, we are here, and so hopefully you'll get something out of this presentation. It is my email, lopezmario9, in case you would like to contact me if you have further questions after these presentations, or if you like the presentation, please do contact me. If you don't like the presentation, here is Angélica Galante's email. You can write to her for complaints, for her choosing wisely and better, before inviting someone. So anywho, so here we go. I like to accomplish two main, purposes in this presentation. First one, I'm gonna try to present these resisting colonial practices carried out by minoritized groups in a multilingual and multimodal fashion. So hang with me because you'll be watching YouTube videos from different parts of Latin America. And then I also would like to analyze the affirmation practices vis-a-vis issues of language recognition, citizenship, gender, blackness, ethnicity, among other sociocultural factors. And the reason I'm focusing on this is because these are the issues that actually artists in Latin America speak about and deal with on a daily basis. So this is not really my issues, right? It's not because I like to focus on language recognition, but because for the people, for the artists in this text that I'll be focusing on, that's an important aspect, right? Citizenship, like for example, imagine you were listening to videos and to creations at the moment in the U.S., for example, and with all the problems that people, especially from Mexican background, have faced with ICE, right? I'm sure the issue of citizenship will be something relevant for them, right? Who determines who's a citizen? Is it really the color of your skin, or whether you can be a target, right? So depending on where you are, then that's a huge issue, right? In terms of gender, for example, right? People in North America may remember, for example, the Me Too movement, right? And especially then the gender issue is coming up much more so now with the Epstein files that have been released, right? Has put the gender issues back in the agenda, and so on and so forth, right? So once again, these social issues, again, is not really my choice, but actually what is important to people. And I think that's also one part of, why is it that we do this work and then focusing on this. So very, very quickly, just to give you a sort of like historic and background context. Before the invasion from the Spanish, by the Spaniards, America, had multiple languages all over, the continent. And these practices, these multilingual practices, were connected to social and historical factors, right, such as nomadic versus sedentary lifestyles, as well as religious and commercial practices, bringing different language in contact. In Mexico, where I'm actually set, we have multiple indigenous language spoken, right? But we cannot actually not really talk about and denying the fact that there were also empires in Mexico. For example, one of the empires, it was based in Michoacan, and the language they spoke was Purepecha. And there was also the Mixtec Empire and Zapotec Empire in Oaxaca. And the Nahuatl is spoken by the most sort of like famous empire in Mesoamerica, los Aztecas, right? So they spoke Nahuatl. So these four languages at one point in Mexico were used as lingua francas, if you sort of like to think of English being a lingua franca at the moment, right? So these languages were part of that. And beyond these languages, of course, in multilingualism, was present daily, and also multiple languages came in contact, for example, during the market day, which is still a current practice in Mexico, like, for example, every Saturday or every Friday in different communities, people from different indigenous communities come together, right? And then they interact in that. And then so multilingualism is actually preserved that way. But also people learn from each other while they interact, right? That's why when linguists, especially linguists who have religious purposes, try to determine where a language begins and when a language ends, I'm talking about language variety, people drive them crazy because then they actually have them hear, let's say, a recording says like, how much do you understand from this language? Assuming that, for example, that is not their language. And people say, yeah, I understand some words because they actually interact with people at the market. And so little by little, they start picking up other languages, right? So people not only speak different name languages, I'm aware of the discussion as to, the issue of naming languages, from Pennycook and Marconi's perspective, and more recently by Ofelia Garcia and others, right? But so not only do they speak different name languages, let's say Mixtec, Zapotec, but then different varieties of those Mixtec, right? So it's a little bit similar, like, the way we, for example, speak, let's say, one variety of Spanish, but then we understand some other varieties, right? And that, for example, talking about Colombian variety and Argentinian, but going beyond that, right, as to how, for example, teenagers and young people start making their own language, sort of like the idiolect, and how people actually become very, very fluent into that, right? So there is evidence actually of Hispanic bi-multilingualism in the words and structural traits shared among different languages currently spoken in northern regions in Peru, for example, is the work by Baliñas Coalla, right? So just talking about, because at times, we think that multilingualism is a current issue, talking about, for example, the view of the late Jean Blomer talking about super diversity, right? Talking about that this super diversity is sort of like provoked the current multilingualism that we have in the world. Well, multilingualism, I think, has been the norm for centuries, not only in the Americas, but also in places like India, in China, right? So I think the fact that multilingual practices were denied because of colonialism and because of one language, one nation ideologies is another issue. But so multilingualism has been the norm, different ways. And I think, for example, this lab in itself is sort of like a testament to that, recognizing the plurilingualism that exists, in the world, or has existed in the world. So moving on, just talking about the contemporary linguistic diversity. Currently, Latin America and the Caribbean remain among the most linguistically diverse regions in the world, with an estimated of 750 indigenous plus languages, and also different Creole languages. I'd like to stop here and then, talk about, what Marconi, for example, has been arguing, and I fully support his view. What is a Creole and what is a language, right? From a very linguistic orientation is highly problematic as to, claiming, this is a Creole and this is a language, right? And especially because many, many different languages throughout history go through that same process, right? Like, for example, if you look at the English language, right? All the influences that it has, that it was the language spoken by the low socioeconomic status people, right? And from the Norman invasion, right? In the sort of like, I think it's sort of like beginning of this century, right? I mean, this millennium and all the influence that it has from French language, in Latin and things, right? So just talking about English is sort of like as Pennycook argues, is a bastard language. And rappers from the hip hop, they say, and we keep bastardizing this language, right? So I think it's just talking about, like counting the language is problematic, right? And Marconi argues that all languages in the world are in fact Creole languages. And with my colleague James Corcoran and others, for example, we just published a book about academic writing in the Americas, and one of the chapters was actually in Creole, right, in Guadalupe Creole, and we did it sort of like as a political stance, as let's do it, let's do a Creole language, but then it raised the question as to who's going to actually make sure that this is written correctly, right? How to make sure that this one has the academic rigor and things, right? So indigenous languages and Creole languages are still analyzed from this perspective that we need to make sure that someone knows them, or we need to make sure that this is valid, right? So there is a huge stigmatization in these aspects, right? But anywho, their use, there's still, we argue that, their use, the current use of these 750 and counting in Creole languages really represents the cultural resistance, hybridity, and the colonial agency among indigenous and Afro-Latin American communities, right? So despite that, colonialism started 500 years ago in America, and, it lasted in Mexico for 300 years, and in most Latin American countries, and then, with coloniality, staying behind, so like colonialism in our minds, right? So the fact that these languages still survive and that people really still use them really, really speaks to people resistance, people creativity as to how and where to use it. Later on, for example, I'll be talking one of the language of the Palenquero in Colombia. So I have people from Colombia here who probably know more about, but I learned about that variety by writing a chapter on and discussing different chapters about multilingualism in Colombia, for example. And I'll tell you more about the creativity that it takes for these languages to, come to life, to be used at the moment and be resisted. So anywho, what was the impact of coloniality? I was mentioning. Mignolo defines coloniality as a condition in which colonialism does not end with the independence of the colonized nation state, and whereby Eurocentric views and ideologies currently remain prevalent, which are propagated by important institutions such as schools, right? So now, what this means is that Mexico allegedly became independent in 1821, right? But colonialism didn't actually leave Mexico. It stayed in people's minds. It stayed in neoliberal thinking that thought that we were not modern individuals if we didn't speak Spanish, that we were not modern individuals if we didn't know how to write alphabetically, I need to argue. In this presentation, I didn't focus, but before the Spaniards came, there were writing systems in place, and they use codices, so like with combining images, color, and even syllabic writing, but that was destroyed. And so the colonial perspective, indigenous languages and creoles are considered dialects, broken languages spoken by Indios or Negroes, hence becoming historically excluded from colonial institutions such as churches, schools, clinics, and congresses, right? Now, even the Spanish language, you may not know this, but I'm also, or like I was part of the theology of liberation when I was a teenager, so I know the history of the Catholic Church, but in Mexico, for example, it was not up to the 1970s that actually the Mass started being conducted in Spanish and other languages. Before it was all in Latin, right? From this idea that, Latin was the language of religion and that was the only language that could capture all the teaching of Christianity and things, right? So there is a lot of issues of language policy, so even Spanish, was not, considered, appropriate for church up to the 70s, right? So there is a lot of issues of coloniality that again are connected to religion, to economics, right, to politics, to ethnicity at the moment, right? And now in Mexico and in many places, right, English has become hegemonic and as part of this coloniality aspect of it, right? So just having this background, right? This presentation will showcase three different multilingual, multimodal texts created by different indigenous and Afro-Latin American artists and their connections to issues of land recognitions, as I mentioned, citizenship, gender, blackness, and ethnicity, among other sociocultural factors. And I'm gonna organize these presentations in three ways. First of all, I'm gonna show you some literary creations in terms of poems, one in Palenquero and one in Mixtec and in Spanish, and then I'll provide the English translations. And then the second thing that I'm going to focus on is musical compositions and then theatrical performances of that, right? Before I move on to the coloniality and what I mean by that, I'm wondering whether people have questions as to sort of like this background about multilingualism in the Americas, so like before the Spaniards, and the views about naming languages and creoles and things. I don't know whether people want to raise their hand or write in the chat. If not, then I'll just wait for 20 seconds. If not, then I'll keep on going. Nope. Okay, great. You're like my students. Okay, great. Nobody asked questions, right? Fantastic. Okay, so then let's move on. And before I start sharing the videos, that we included in this work, I'm just gonna talk a little bit briefly about the coloniality and what I mean by that. Decoloniality can be regarded as the resistance and assertion of subaltern epistemologies and ontologies reconstructed through indigenous languages and creoles in relation to colonial hierarchies. It does not imply the absence or ending of coloniality, but rather, in Catherine Walsh's words, references and marks the postures, positioning, horizons, projects, and practices of being, thinking, sensing, and doing that resist and re-exist, that transgress and interrupt the colonial metrics of power. Right? This is a heavy definition that really deals with different aspects in terms of, ontologies, who we are, right? And epistemologies, what we know. But what I like about Catherine Walsh perspective is the issue of resist and re-exist in the world, right? For me, the aspect of re-exist, right, is very, very important because at times people are dehumanized and people somehow are erased in sometimes physical ways, but also in ideological ways. For example, the Spanish language, right? The Spanish language, uses gender, and there is a huge discussion as to, whether, it is an inclusive language or whether we like to make it inclusive, right? But for example, referring to in sort of like in male gender, grammatical aspect, because one man is present in the room, and then so like not really addressing women is sort of like you're invisibilizing women there. You're making them disappear, you're making them invisible with that, right? So, with this aspect, I think the re-exist is very, very important, and I'll try to point that in more visual terms, perspective. Decoloniality also challenges the traditional view of language, recognizing and valuing other semiotic resources or multimodalities such as visual, corporal, and pictographic connected to indigenous Afro-American peoples, ontologies, and epistemologies. And this is my view of multimodality, right? These multimodal and hybrid practices often occur within subalternity, whereby they are typically judged according to Eurocentric standards, such as schools, as they are not considered formal, legitimate, or worthy enough to be included in the curriculum that regard them as inferior, right? So, and this is the reason why you'll be watching videos, because I like you to, experience firsthand, what I mean by multimodalities, right? In some of the videos, I'll be able to provide some of the translation into English, right? But then I like you to focus to not only about understanding, for example, the songs, that, you'll see a group of, teenagers from different countries in Latin America talking about gender issues, mostly, but how they use different words, body language to communicate and actually to show they can resist by the way they dress, by the way they look, right? That can be even more powerful actually than the words they're uttering, right? So this is my point about the importance of multimodality. So also decoloniality, beyond traditional institutions, grassroots organization and collective meetings, music studios, and community theaters have become key spaces where indigenous and Afro-Latin American languages flourish, and where multilingual, multimodal practices actively resist coloniality while asserting collective presence in the world, right? So when we actually wrote this handbook chapter, we were given the instruction that focus on multilingualism outside of schools. At the beginning, it was like, wow, how can we do that? But then that wasn't the best part of actually doing this work with my colleagues. That once we started looking at grassroots organizations, collective meetings, music studios, this is where we found that multilingualism is actually more prevalent, and where we can see actually people, resisting these notions of who determines, whether what they speak is worthy of being in a school, in a textbook, right? But then they say like, well, you may not let me, but I'm gonna still do it, right? And they do it through literal creation, right? So anyway, so I'm gonna start with the first theme, which is literary creations, right? So as I just mentioned before, right, I just like to acknowledge that before and during the colonial period, indigenous groups engaged in complex literacy practices such as codices, which included alphabet writing, right? In 1980, in Mexico especially, but also places in America, there was a resurgence of indigenous and Afro literature publications prompted by different factors. Social conflicts in different parts of Latin America, for example, the Zapatista rebellion in Mexico that started in 1990, as well as the university enrollment of young indigenous and Afro peoples and grassroots activists. This production goes beyond the creation of art's sake or language revitalization and in response to a political and decolonial agenda, as argued by Cifuentes and Aria, right? So the fun part of the presentation, not the boring part. So this, I like you to meet Nadia Lopez Garcia, and she's a bilingual poet. She actually speaks Spanish, Tusabi, which is also known as Mixtec, an indigenous language from Oaxaca. She writes poetry in indigenous languages, right? And in her perspective, right, writing poetry in indigenous language is political in terms of challenging the hegemony of Spanish in Mexico, since the presence of indigenous language in literary texts is a reminder that these languages are here to stay, even there is no governmental and societal support, right? It is a social performance which has the power to address current social issues such as violence against women, as we will see in Nadia Lopez Garcia. I'd like to point out, interestingly enough, I met Nadia when she came to our university 4 years ago, and there is this huge controversy because maybe 2 weeks ago, and the director of the production of textbooks in Mexico was fired because of political reasons and apparently gender issues. And Nadia was appointed as the new director of textbooks. So some people are extremely happy that she's being selected as such because now indigenous women are being recognized. Other people see it like, oh, poor Nadia, she was given a position that is highly contested now, and people are questioning her legitimacy as to her, again being viewed as someone who may not be, worthy enough for the position. But anywho, you can just Google her, and it's interesting all different reaction. But today I'm focusing more on Nadia as not the new director of textbook production in Mexico, but her work as a poet, right? And this first poem written in Tunsabi. You'll see Tunsabi on the left here, and here is the English translations, and I'll read you the poem in Spanish. So there you go. He visto mujeres de ojos negros y lluvia. He visto mujeres que lloran y ríen, mujeres agua y tierra, mujeres despojadas y mujeres pájaro. He visto mujeres palabra, mujeres río, mujeres cielo. Rezo por ver mujeres siempre, mujeres que digan su palabra en este ancho cielo, como jícaras con mucha agua, jícaras desbordantes que escurren y mojan las semillas de la tierra y florecen en lo más sagrado. Right? Um, I have to confess that I'm not really a poem person, right? But I think just looking as to how Nadia writes, then you can talk about so many different aspects as to, gender issues that should be addressed, not only in Mexico in the moment, but in the US, for example. And all the controversy again with the Epstein files, about how young women were abused or have been abused, by the elite in the world, and it's being recorded, so I won't be naming people, but you know who I'm talking about. Um, so this is another poem by Nadia, and this is also about, this is called Cuentachi, Bad Wind is called. And you can have, again, the version in Tunsabi on the left and the English translation, and I'll be reading in Spanish. Mi padre dice que las mujeres no soñamos, que aprenda de tortillas y café, que aprenda a guardar silencio. Dice que ninguna mujer escribe. Soy la niña que lloró la ausencia, la lejanía y el miedo. Hoy digo mi nombre en lo alto, soy una mujer pájaro, semilla que florece. Las palabras son mis alas, mi tierra mojada. And what, I like just to point the fact in this poem, Nadia does so like a introspective, analysis about her life and, challenges, his father ideologies, because, this coloniality has also always reproduced, within the families, right? And I always tell my students, it is not that our parents are racist or, or modernists or colonialists, whatever you want to call them, but it is the history about colonialism and coloniality that somehow, have put ideas and ideologies into people's minds that make them see that women should only learn about tortillas and coffee and not really, for example, the post that Nadia was offered at the moment, right? So just as a quick analysis, in both poems, Lope Garcia's poetry denounces how indigenous women are at the receiving end of discriminatory practices and increasing violence, imagining alternative futures where women can raise their voice against injustices in reconnect to the land and indigenous practice denies by coloniality, as the way she refers to tierra mojada, wetland. The concepts of river woman, sky woman, and a bird woman go beyond mere analogies. It is the author's way to reposition herself and other indigenous women as authors and dreamers who are no longer quiet and who write back and speak back to colonial practices, to even against family members. And So let me introduce you now to quickly to El Palenquero, which is something fascinating to me when I actually learn about this language. In Colombia, especially, but also in Mexico, as you know, as part of this, as part of colonialism, hundreds of thousands of African slaves were brought into the Americas to exploit the mines and different aspects in America. So in Colombia, something quite interesting happened. Different indigenous language, African languages were spoken, right? So again, they came from different ethnic groups in Africa. So they started creating their own, right? They started mixing those languages as a way to speak back to the Spaniards. So they would not understand what they were saying. So that was huge resistance. But in order to do that, they created a new language that could be understood by different African speakers, right? So it's sort of like, the Palenquero language is a Spanish-based Creole language spoken mainly in San Basilio Palenque, but it has an Afro-descendant community in northern Colombia, right? So what you'll hear in this Palenquero poet reading in Palenquero in some Spanish.
Llegaste a suelo barranquillero, anhelando tejer tus trenzas con perlas doradas. Y Senda Miriam Díaz Pérez, Ita Macanea, o Utumi, o Mochiliasuto. Y soy portadora de un legado ancestral para la salvaguarda de la lengua argentina. Ay, lo mía, tacota, más la lengua palenquera no es solo un vehículo dinamizador del habla, de la lengua, sino lo que contenía en sí misma, todos esos hechos, todos esos saberes, esa parte espiritual tan divina y a la vez profana. Entonces, todos esos elementos me llamaban mucho la atención, porque eso es lo que hace única la lengua, la hace muy rica. Esa África que se estremece con sueños fúnebres cuando canta el pájaro de la muerte. Amigo mía, Dakota, Guasina, en la tepela maluga kuashi, utata, una, sibaluga ocha. Apuna muerte.
This is exactly what I was talking about, multimodality, right? For the peoples like many of us who do not speak Palenquero, you say, well, I don't know what she said, right? But there is so much said without words, right? In the way, for example, dances are presented, on the way she uses, so like singing, in between her poem, in the way that many of those aspects can be presented. But when you look at, for example, the way people were dancing, as she said, it could be something as not accepted as profano, right? For example, the different comments about Bad Bunny's, for example, presentation at the Super Bowl. Oh, that's not appropriate for children and things, right? So there's still a lot of resistance about that. So anyway, I like to point to the fact that other Afro-Latin American writers actually exist, and they view and they talk about the Latin American negritud, blackness, as a decolonizing force capable of claiming or defending their Black identities against the influence of colonization. From the left to the right, we have Manuel Zapata from Colombia, René Strepe from Haiti, and Quince Ducan from Costa Rica. So there's a lot of African production in literary, right? So let's talk about musical compositions now, and I'll be trying to move quickly so we can have time for questions. Young people across Latin America have used music composition, hip hop, rap, and other music genres as assemblage of multiple languages and modalities, or what Fabricio and Moita Lopez, Brazilian educators, conceptualize abject aesthetics, a specular semiotic landscape in which mixed sexualities, genders, races, ethnicities, clothing style, hairstyle, rhythms, languages, and registers interact. In the performance, indigenous and Afro-Latin American singers raise their voice in order to decolonize the realities by reconnecting to the land, right? So again, land is very, very important to them. Just some noteworthy examples. We have the Bro MCs, which we'll listen to, an indigenous group rap from Brazil. The lyrics highlight this bad deep's connection to their place of origin and their concern from their traditional land occupied. Kunumi MC, a Guarani rapper who has shown support for the struggle of Brazilian indigenous group to gain the legal recognition of their lands. Nación Rap, a hip-hop band from Bolivia who has used its music to evoke traditional Bolivian felt connections to coca plant producing land as a way to demand respect for the land again. So as you can see, so like land issues in especially South America is huge, right? So here it is one of those bands, and here you have the some translation, by Nachimento, and you'll see, the language that they speak, and then you'll see the English translation here. So we're gonna listen to a little bit of this, only like maybe 1 minute or so.
Salve, salve, câmera ligada. Esse som fala pouco sobre a realidade da cidade que vivemos, Dourados, Mato Grosso do Sul, onde muitas vezes os indígenas são tidos como gentes invisíveis, imperceptíveis aos olhos da sociedade. Neste mundo em que vivemos só existe ilusão. Por isso eu te digo, se ligue, meu irmão. Amor, amizade e a paixão, sonhos que se vão e deixam para trás tamanha recordação. Sempre que acordo, mais uma noite se passou. Todos nossos sonhos se perderam pelo amor. Tenho fé em Deus que tudo vai mudar. Basta ter talento, lutar e confiar. Sei que não é fácil viver assim. Criminalidade, violência neste mundo, enfim. Te mostro a vida de verdade. Seja bem-vindo à minha realidade. Sei que quando eu passo, me olha diferente e a gente luta pra manter a nossa crença. O homem branco traz doença,
Anyway, for the interest of time, you'll have the presentation. Hopefully you can watch the whole thing. And I also like to pick Angelica's brains, bring a Brazilian, speaker, as to, how this could be vilified. Anyway, through the lyrics, Bro MCs conveys a message of courage and hope, challenging the invisibility of indigenous people as Brazilian citizens. And once again, citizenship issues. Bro MCs and other indigenous and Afro-Latin American singers also bring racial issues to the front in Latin America, reflecting both on the colonial legacy of African slavery in the Americas and the connection between rap music and its Black origins in the US. So this is another video I'd like to show, and this is a group of different rappers from all over Latin America and they're called We Are Women, We Are Hip Hop, and this is their song Latin America Unida. This is sort of like the main chorus of the song. Hoy hacemos el stop. So I just want you to listen at least a couple of minutes to this.
Somos la luz en medio de la oscuridad. Somos mujeres listas para así luchar. Unimos nuestras voces para no pecar y exigir el derecho a la vida. Las murallas mentales que nos dividen, piden que olvide, pero mi arte no les exime. Dime. Cuestión de género, no venero, la unión es poder y más problema de género. Detrás de una lección de combatientes, estoy dando a la voz de hombres y mujeres. La primera prueba de quien no hay quien pueda poner su pie de queda donde la lucha se queda. La lucha algo dilata, se transmite como plaga, trasciende fronteras. Bajo una sola bandera, se luta que el entusiasmo y hombro no se trabaja. Otra vez resistencia, Latinoamérica se levanta, suenan las voces de los barrios libres, hombres y mujeres, sin prejuicios que dividen, ni géneros ni razas, nuestras latas y gargantas defienden un movimiento, aquí las ramas proclaman. Heredera de guerreras que ponen el vientre como fuente de poder, no somos inocentes, somos fuente del potente grito que el continente lanza a través del rap y aún no es suficiente. HH nos inspira y por eso es que unidas hemos decidido consagrar la vida con la búsqueda de la sabiduría, nuestra guía, la necesidad de poner en palabras rebeldía. Nadie entiende. Sentido de igualdad.
Because I don't know you, but I'm just amazed by the deep thought in this in the lyrics of this. We can read books, articles about gender and gender issues, but just by listening to what they're saying, it's just amazing how much they actually can say in very, very creative ways. This is another group that I'd like to show you. And this is a song that is called Canción Sin Miedo. And before I show you actually the lyrics, this was a song first performed in Spanish, but then they invited Al Viento Florido, which is the only music band only formed by women. In the past, in indigenous communities, the bands were usually only males, but these women say like, why can women play, right? So these are before I turn, this is the lyrics, and that you will actually see. And I want you to point because it's very, very powerful. No, it's called Canción Sin Miedo. You'll have here the Spanish translation, and this is the Spanish version. Que tiemble el Estado, los cielos, las calles, que tiemblen los jueces y los judiciales. Hoy a las mujeres nos quitan la calma, nos sembraron miedo, nos crecieron alas. A cada minuto de cada semana nos roban amigas, nos matan hermanas, destrozan sus cuerpos, los desaparecen. No olvide sus nombres, por favor, señor presidente. Right? So this song really talks about, the disappearance, about many, many women in Mexico from Las Muertes de Juárez that it's been for decades, but the abuse of feminism, right? So this is the version of the song. Let me go back to it, that you can actually hear the music.
Tiembla el Estado, cielos, las calles, que teman los jueces y los judiciales. Hoy a las mujeres nos quitan la calma, nos sembraron miedo, nos crecieron alas. When someone's all luchan magug to hands up, to go to yuk to kata, but to kata you know, times no na mañana, que dicha ti todas las compas luchando en reforma, por todas las morras peleando en Sonora, por las comandantas luchando por Chiapas, por todas las madres buscando el Portugal. What's the yok the number who got your vaccine and what's the father who just not you want what the you I thought you go I keep you back so go push us for a call go get me I go let's come when you guy and the group to get one little
Please do watch the video. Is quite powerful, and even just the lyrics and things about women disappearing and the actual names of that, right? So just to finish this section and wrapping up, all the music artists describing this section have produced their musical composition outside formal institutions. We usually regard them as inappropriate or even foreign. They have looked for other spaces, both physical and virtual, to voice their demands while showing us the power of assemblages of multiple languages and modalities to reach greater audiences and to engage the colonial projects. I don't know you, but sometimes, all the articles that we spend months, writing and things about plurilingualism, decoloniality, don't reach, all the audiences that we should reach. And these women, these artists, then they reach, look at their videos, they have thousands of views, about people listening to what they have to say. So anyway, the final aspect is theoretical performances, and I just want to argue that there is evidence of different plays transmitted orally through generations before the arrival of the Spanish people. So theater was part of indigenous peoples in the Americas before the Spaniards came. For example, we have the Rabina Lachi, a Mayan play from the 13th century, the ballet de Wungose, a Nahuatl play from the 16th century, and the Ollantay, a Quechua play from the 16th century. The resurgence of theatrical plays goes hand in hand with that of indigenous and Afro-Latin American literary creations previously discussed. It is a communal or group effort that utilizes different semiotic resources, including indigenous languages. Just some examples of the different theatrical groups across the America. We have Teatro Campesino Indígena, which is based in Yucatan, Teatro para la Memoria in Colombia and Ecuador, University Student Theater Group in Ecuador, Mapuche Theater Group El Catango in Argentina and Chile. We have young actors in Bolivia, in Afro-Latin American playwrights, include the anthology by Pamela Codornes and Darío Jaramillo, which is a collection representing multiple Afro-Latin American theatrical voices. So just very quickly, before I show you the play, let me give you just the English version, so you can just enjoy actually the play for 2-3 minutes. It says, "We are the Otomi children sharing the fire of our spirit. At the beginning, in the immensity of the inhabitable, when only the night and day embrace the world, see that their God decided to share their life with beings made in his likeness. Siddharth took the womb of Mother Earth, and from its core arose timid beings who recognized themselves and with time started to populate the Ñañu territory. Siddhartha gave us seeds, taught us how to cultivate the land, how to transform the foods that sprang from those seeds into meals while respecting Mother Earth and honoring Siddhartha to live in balance with nature. With this, for a long time, our Ñañu community lived in harmony. The dreams of our elders foresaw enormous fires, the death of our people. One morning from the sea came white spirits, so pale like death, half demon, half men, blinded by greed, deafened by their interest, and indifferent to suffering without any respect to our God. They invaded our land, imposing their traditions and their God, for allow white men to murder us. If we lose our language, we stop seeing the world." And this is the play. Let me go back to the play. It is called La llama que no se extingue, the flame that does not get extinguished.
Nuke daño que tiuñe no de mate. Somos los hijos otomíes, compartiendo el fuego de nuestro espíritu. Al principio, en la inmensidad de lo inevitable, cuando solamente la noche y el día abrazaban el mundo, Siddhartha decidió compartir la vida con seres hechos a su semejanza. Tomó el vientre de la madre tierra y de sus entrañas surgieron seres tímidos que se reconocieron y con el paso del tiempo poblaron el territorio ñañú. Sidara, Viragi, Yadedo, Neu Tarijo Gampote Yagón, de Temega Uñi, Neo Pansaki Mansino no Shimoi, do de Mo, Tajata Sidara, Pabu Shinyo, Konosi Hoy, Toi, De, Netsi. Sí, pero ahora, y te vija por ver, Neno, Hoitash, y Hioka dijo. Los sueños de nuestros ancianos presagiaron fuegos enormes, la muerte de nuestro pueblo. Una mañana, del mar surgieron espíritus blancos, tan pálidos como la muerte, mitad demonio, mitad hombre, ciegos por su avaricia, sordos por su interés, indiferentes al sufrimiento, sin respeto a nuestra deidad, invadieron nuestra tierra, imponiendo sus costumbres y a su Dios, quien permitió que los hombres blancos nos asesinaran. No moringuiño, inquimani, que andi asari. Si perdemos nuestra lengua, dejamos de ver el mundo.
No, well, just the beginning of the play, as you see, they created this atmosphere of blackness and, how this flame that indigenous language Yanyu still exists. And it says, if we lose our language, we stop seeing the world. This last sentence, summarizing the importance of language, conveys that indigenous and Afro-Latin American peoples, by using their indigenous language and creoles in place and other aspects of life, are able to interact with the world in their own terms. This makes their being, sensing, and doing in the world as they transgress and interrupt the colonial metrics of power. Right? The play lasts for maybe 45 minutes. If you're interested in watching it, it's worth seeing. So just to conclude, for the interest of time, indigenous and Afro-American literature, music, and theater uses multiple similar resources and multilingual practices. These artistic forms aim to reposition communities in the world and reconnect with land and cultural heritage. They actively challenge colonial discourses that frame their knowledge, identities, and social role as inferior. Using indigenous languages and creoles is a political affirmation of presence and resistance. Using colonial languages is a strategic choice to reach wider audiences, connect with other indigenous and Afro groups, and build Pan-American alliances. These multilingual artistic practices function as counter-cultural decolonial projects, resisting long-standing linguistic and cultural domination. Right? Just as a add-on to this conclusion, I just want to point to the fact that at times we get BAs, MAs, PhDs, spend countless numbers of hours arguing for in favor of multilingualism, prolingualism, decoloniality, right? But again, our work sometimes reaches very, very few people, and these practices occur without our input, our own alliance with them. People are doing this in America already, without any support from academics who are actually in favor of this. So just to argue on this research aspect of it, right? More research is needed on how multilingual and multimodal practices create collective political voices. Scholars should move beyond traditional ethnography towards collaborative, socially engaged research, so like ethnographic practices as argued by Higgins. The coloniality for these communities extends beyond art and language to include recognitions of knowledge systems and identity, citizenship and land rights, addressing structural violence, including violence against women. Muchas gracias. Muito obrigado. Sorry, I went over 2 minutes of your time. And again, I like to acknowledge that this is not my work; it's the work of thousands of Afro and also indigenous people in the Americas who are actually doing great things in very creative and showing us that multilingualism and prolingualism is possible and that it can actually speak against the social order, the world social order that they're trying to impose on us. Bueno, muchas gracias. Voy a dejar de compartir. Gracias.
All right, all right. Thank you, Dr. Mario López-Gopar, for this presentation, this wonderful presentation, for your reflections, your insights, and also this exposition of the creative work of people in Latin America and the Caribbean. So thank you, everyone.